It looks like everyone's signed in now, so thank you again for joining us this afternoon. I'm Lauren Sluga, the Regional Director from MISO, and I'm joined this afternoon by Rush Milam, another analyst here on the MISO desk. And we're going to take you through the MISO winter outlook. Our outlook does span January and February since we're already kind of deep into December. So getting started here this afternoon, what we're seeing is a quick agenda. First, looking at a recap of 2013 last winter, then moving into a weather and demand forecast, taking a look at the wind expectations for winter 2014, then looking at the top 5 constraints for this year, touching on MISO South integration, and then a last look at fuel pricing. So starting with winter 2014, overall, we are expecting to see some bullish pressure on Indy Hub for January and February. This is really on the back of our demand forecast, which at the moment is expecting a colder than normal winter for both the Midwest and the new MISO South region. Again, colder temperatures more likely to increase that demand, especially in January, where we're seeing well below temperatures expected. And again, we'll get into that a little bit further into the presentation. We're also seeing some slightly higher gas pricing year over year, which has potentially increased the price of generation and therefore bringing up the overall price. We're also looking at strength in western wind, which actually may contribute to an overall bearish congestion pattern in Indy, so kind of similar to what we've been seeing the past couple of days really in the footprint. Lastly, just touching on that MISO South integration, slated still to go live in 2 weeks' time on the 19th, and that will be adding 3 new hubs to the footprint, so that is something we're really kind of looking forward to winter 2014. And just as a side note here, we did host a webinar yesterday about our expectations for MISO South and the integration. If you would like a copy of the webinar from yesterday, we do have the slide deck as well as the copy of the presentation available. So getting into the winter in review. Last winter, looking at January and February, average peak demand in January around 64.7. Average Indiana settle is around 32.23, and are looking at a Chicago City gas price around 3.49. In February, a little bit weaker demand there, 63.8, kind of coming out of that dead of winter. Looking at the average Indy settle a little bit cheaper as a result, around 31.46, and the gas dropping also around 3.45. Looking at the strongest days of the month, January peak load around 73.8. So I'd settle that day around 54.79, and then February, looking at a peak again slightly below that at 72.2, a settle at 49.25. Looking 2013 versus 2014 expectations, we are, as I mentioned, expecting those much colder temperatures, especially in January. As a result, we're looking at a little bit higher, I think, average settle for both months going forward. Now taking a quick look at the top constraints from last year. Looking at the top of the list, kind of some old familiar favorites. East Winnemac to Monticello kind of topping out that list. Hourly counts for the day had at 1,000 hours. Average price over that was about $2.78 for the shadow price, and the most common month was February. Again, looking at the reason, you were looking at strong central zone wind and the Palisades Yukon outage. Likelihood to repeat, we are kind of looking for this again. What we're seeing again is a lot of strong wind in the forecast for January and February, and then again a repeat on that Palisades nuke outage. Looking at the top 3, La Crosse to Cooley with about 862 occurrences over the course of the winter. Average shadow price there about $61, and the most common month around January. What we were seeing there were outages around Genoa, La Crosse, Tap, Harmony, Lansing, and Alma. I'm not seeing those same outages right now on the scheduler for the winter, so not expecting to see that repeat. However, we are still looking at that Glenworth transformer congestion, just running at the top 3 here at about 700 occurrences. Looking at an average shadow price of about $96, and again, that most frequent month in January. Looking at the driver for that congestion, we were seeing line work around Lime Creek to Barton, and as that is still in the scheduler at this point, we are expecting to see some risk for that to continue as well. Just rounding out the top here, also seeing some of that risk around Wildwood to Mason, Vail, Havana, Springfield, Ireton, Blue Earth, Manistee, and Toledo to Marshalltown. Again, looking at that likely to repeat column, that's just looking at the reason we have for the driver in 2013 and whether or not we're seeing a similar setup for 2014. Looking at a similar analysis now, but for the real time, looking at the top 5 constraints here, You first off are kicking off with Prairie State, West Mount Vernon. Over the course of those 2 months, we had about 715 5-minute occurrences. The average shadow price over those about $13, and again, the most common month in February. Reason for that congestion, again, strong output from nearby coal-fired units in that St. Louis region to really kind of cluster around southern Illinois as well, and an outage around Joppa. So again, still expecting that strong output from coal-fired generation down in the St. Louis metropolitan area, and so again, seeing that likelihood for that congestion to repeat in 2014. Additionally, seeing that Wildwood-Mason congestion risk coming back in, about 460 occurrences there, most common month around January. We did have line work last winter at Gray Summit to Tyson. Not expecting to see that repeat this year, as that outage has yet to make the scheduler at this point. Again, just to round out the top 3, some of that Glenworth transformer risk in there, 400 occurrences here in the real time over those 5-minute ticks. Again, the most common month around January, and what we're seeing there is line work around Lime Creek to Barton. Again, with that still on the scheduler, there is concern that you see that congestion pop back up here. Again, just to round out the list, looking at Monticello, East Winnemac, Savannah, Springfield, Oak Grove, Galesburg, Toledo to Marshalltown, Leda, Sandusky, Newton, Robinson, and La Crosse. So seeing some of these, again, potentially for 2014, really kind of keeping an eye, as we mentioned, the day-ahead outlook for Monticello, East Winnemac, but also still liking the risk around Havana, Springfield, Oak Grove to Galesburg, Toledo to Marshalltown, and some of that Newton, Robinson as well. So now getting into our outlook for 2014, looking at some seasonal demand and weather forecasts compiled by our meteorologists here on staff. Looking at January 2014, as you can see, our map very blue, especially in northern MISO, seeing well below normal temperatures, so you're about 3 to 4 degrees colder than average, and then really kind of trickling out from there. So your Des Moines, Indianapolis, and Cincinnati kind of swath, about 2 to 3 degrees colder. And then the southern part of the footprint looking about 1 degree to 2 degrees colder than average. So January looking a little bit colder, but that flipping here in February, seeing that below normal, expected still for the northern half of the footprint, but then seeing that turn a little bit here for MISO South. So again, really kind of focusing around St. Louis and then that Little Rock and NOLA area for the integration. Looking overall at 2014, again, we are expecting that colder than normal winter for both the Midwest and that southern region, especially around that Great Lakes region. Looking at anomalies driven by persistent cold airflow in the upper Midwest through essentially midwinter, and then those cold anomalies do start pulling back a little bit in February, but are obviously remaining in place as our map showed around the Great Lakes. Going into risk, again, there is some variability to that pattern that could interrupt the sustained cold that we're expecting. And if we do see that interruption, that will kind of draw back a little bit on that expected below normal cold. Additionally, snowpack obviously going to help build in some of those cold temperatures. So if we don't see that sustained cold pack for the first half of the winter, there is some risk that you don't get that as cold of forecast. Moving on from there, though, historical weather trends and when to expect your peak winter load. From 2005 to 2012, we were looking at strongest demand of the year, typically around mid-December to mid-January. Then looking at the coldest temperatures, typically between the middle of January for those major demand centers. Looking at winter peak demand occurring typically on Monday through Thursday of the 8 past years. And based on patterns that we're looking for, we are looking for peak demand to fall in mid-January of this year. Getting into a little bit more of a meteorological forecast here, now looking at wind generation. Historical wind as a kind of a result of the installed capacity. The blue line here looking at the off-peak trend, the pink line at the on-peak. And as you can see, as we're getting further into winter here, we are seeing an uptick in expectations for the percentage of installed capacity, historical wind generation. So we're getting up to that 45% level. Again, not really a surprise as we're starting to see some stronger wind here, especially in recent days, and expecting that to continue to be strong going forward into January and February. Again, west wind typically a little bit stronger than the central wind during this period, and that trend is expected to remain pretty steady heading into the spring. So again, expecting a lot of western wind events relative to central. And then looking at stronger western wind and colder temperatures in Minneapolis, potentially contributing to that bullish min, bearish Indy hub congestion pattern that I mentioned at the start of the broadcast. And again, we will get into that a little bit here into the congestion calls for the winter 2014 season. So starting things off, Rock Creek to Magnolia congestion, a top concern here for the next 2 months. What we're seeing there is line work around Heron Lake to Lakefield. That line work scheduled out of service from December 3rd through about March 14th. And again, some potential to see that strong western wind generation here. So what we're seeing is kind of a push of power from western Minnesota towards that major demand center in Minneapolis. So again, expecting that upside on min. Next, we're looking at some Dresser-Allendale congestion risk. Here, starting at the end of January, but then going through the month of February, we do have some line work around Staunton to Wabash River. So any strength in load coming out of that winter peak, especially around that central zone area, could help to aggravate this congestion, driving a little bit of upside on ND for those particular days. Next up, Prairie Island Byron congestion. Again, another kind of bullish min pattern here. Looking at line work around Prairie Island to Red Rock from mid-January to the end of the month. That line coming out of service again in February from the 3rd through March. Again, shifting some of that risk over to Prairie Island to Blue Lake at that point. Risk for both of those constraints amplified by the fact that we are looking for Prairie Island 2 to return, and right now scheduled return around mid-December for that unit. Next up, looking at East Winnemac transformer congestion, looking at line work here at Schaefer-Borough, Gleesburg from the beginning of January through the end of the month. Again, especially a concern if we're looking at that strong central zone wind coming in, and then lighter risk around that Creed-St. John area also associated with the outage. But as we saw on both the day ahead and real-time risk from last year, both of those coming in top kind of constraint calls. So again, we're looking for that to repeat in the winter of 2014. Lastly here, looking at Hazelton transformer congestion, looking at line work schedule on Hazelton to Blackhawk from mid-December here through the end of January. With that, looking at strongest potential when wind generation is on the weaker side. So any of those weaker wind days, but cold temperatures still dominating Minneapolis, really helping to drive the congestion pull there. Then lastly here, just kind of wrapping up, looking at market changes. As I mentioned earlier, we did have a webinar for MISO South integration and our expectations there, so please feel free to contact us to get a copy of that. But just the highlights here, again, MISO announcing the integration of Entergy back in 2011. The integration adding close to about 30 gigawatts of additional summer peak demand and about 48 gigawatts of generation, and that 48 includes existing, under construction, and planned units. MISO and Genscape have both identified top constraints. Overlap there included the Nelson 500 line, Hartburg 500 kV to Cypress, and PPG Roseloaf on the 230 kV system. In addition to that, MISO will be adding 3 new hubs, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. And over here at Genscape, we will be adding the Arkansas hub to our daily reports starting on December 19th, so that integration day. That will be going in for the BAL day next day and included in the recap report. And again, a little bit of concern about kind of pegging which of those hubs will be the most liquid. Right now, we are looking at Arkansas with that expectation, but if we do see changes in the market, we will adjust the reports accordingly. So lastly, just to round up the overall webinar here, we are looking at a quick fuel analysis since we are going to be looking at a little bit more gas in the fuel mix post-integration and in for January and February. Looking at Henry Hub pricing, January right now around 371 for both January and February. Last year around 333, and the difference about 38 cents there. Looking at Mishcon as a premium to Henry Hub right now, January about 4 cents up, February about 3 cents up. But that does kind of conclude our initial slides here. We do have a couple questions that have come in, so we're going to take a moment just to look at those, and we'll get back to you in a second. Thank you. So first couple questions, just a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of the slides and this broadcast with a follow-up email. So again, don't worry, those will be coming across. Next question was whether or not we are expecting some of the congestion that we've been seeing more recently, especially that South Bend to Blue Earth, to continue into January and February. We are looking at the expectation to see that continue, especially if we're still looking at strength in wind going into January. And that's going to be especially relevant if we're still looking at those really well below average forecasts for that Minneapolis area. So we are still expecting to see that, especially kind of as we're still looking at about the 40 to 45% installed capacity for the wind generation. The next question we have here, again, just looking at some of that south detail. We were looking yesterday at some of our demand expectations. Looking at our weightings there, we were looking at NOLA and New Orleans as kind of the top in terms of the weightings, so some concern that you might see some shifts going forward in that demand forecast. We do generally see a little bit of a lag and a milder forecast for the south during that time, so expecting that and then changing obviously as we get into the summer. But that was all we were seeing come across for right now. Let me just take one more look at the questions and see if anything else come across. So someone's asked what the expectation kind of looks like for a first look for Integration Day. What we're looking at right now for next week loads, we're looking pretty cold right now. We're actually right in that same level that we were seeing in terms of peak demand last year in January, so looking around 74 gigs at the moment. Taking a first look at Entergy and MISO South load expectations, right now we are looking at roughly a 23 gig load forecast for the South on top of what we're seeing for that MISO load overall. So that does bring us up to about a combined 97 gigs for potential load towards the end of December here. That does look to conclude all of the questions we have at the moment. If we didn't get to your question or you can think of something later on, again, please feel free to contact us. We're available online on IM at MISO Genscape. And then my email contact is also available on this last slide here. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Take care. Bye.